Question number 45 on the reading portion of College Boards Test 5. Which question was McGuire's study of mental athletes primarily intended to answer? So what question was McGuire's study of mental athletes? So now we're talking about mental athletes only. What did she want to answer? What question did she want to answer? Realize that 45 is connected to 46. 46 is a quote question. So we have to answer these together. However, let's take a look at the answer choice to 45, see if we can narrow down some options based on what we remember. Well, I remember that the mental athletes, her main reason of trying to understand mental athletes, she wanted to figure out if they wanted to, again, it's like, I hate this, it's in this quote, but this is just what I remember, line 33, they wanted to find out if the memorizers' brains were, like the London cabbies, structurally different from the rest, or if they were somehow just making better use of memory abilities. So what question does she want to answer? She wants to know, do these mental athletes have physically different brains, just like the London cabbies, or do they make different use of their brain? That was the question that she wanted to answer, because she asks it before we talk about the study. Again, that's just like what I remember. That's the question, like why did she bother doing this? We talk about the London cabbies at first in order to juxtapose or contrast rather, these mental athletes, depending. So let's take a look at these answer choices for 45. What question was McGuire's study of mental athletes primarily intended to answer? Does the act of memorization make use of different brain structures than does the act of navigation? Well, I don't think this is it, because let's understand what it's saying. Does the act of memorization make use of different brain structures than does the act of do we care about navigation versus memorization and whether or not that changes or, activates different parts of the brain? This is not a study on what happens to the brain when you memorize versus what happens to the brain when you navigate. We care about mental athletes and whether or not they have physically different brains than other people. This is not about memorization versus navigation, but it's only in relation to these people, the cabbies and the mental athletes, obviously, that we care about. So I don't like how A is going off into a broader understanding of this topic when we really only care about the subjects at hand, which are the mental athletes and the cabbies and their brains. Not the fact of saying, well, in general, memorization versus navigation, are they different? I don't know. We don't know that for a fact. What about B? Is this the question she wants to answer? Do mental athletes inherit their unusual brain structures, or do the structures develop as a result of specific activities? Is this really the question? Is it nature versus nurture? I think that this is actually more simple than that. We're not asking, oh, is this inherited? Or do they do certain activities in order to get this? We do find out at the last sentence of the piece that they actually are the result of training and practice. However, is this the question she wants to answer? Is she wondering, McGuire, is she dying to know, I wonder if this is inherited or if it's, the result of specific activities? That's not what she cares about. Take it one step back. She just wants to know, is there a difference? Is there physical differences in one group versus another? Not getting so far off saying like, okay, is it inherited or is it, nurtured? B is, I think, just taking it a step too far in a direction that we don't discuss in the passage at all. What about C? Is this the question that she wanted to answer? Does heightened memorization ability reflect abnormal brain structure or an unusual use of normal brain structure? I like this. I like this a lot because this is exactly, circling the idea that we care about. Namely, when she initially did this study, she wanted to know, were the brain structures different, line 35, or were they somehow just making better use of memory abilities? Did they reflect an abnormal brain structure or an unusual use of normal brain structure? Was it physically different, or do they just use different parts of the brain? And what do we find out? It turns out they actually don't have physically different brains, but they use different parts. So they use the normal brain unusually. I really like C. I like how that encompasses everything that we talked about in the passage. What about D? Which question was McGuire's study of mental athletes primarily intended to answer? What is the relationship between general cognitive ability and the unusual brain structures of mental athletes? again, we don't know that the brain structures of mental athletes are unusual. If anything, we find out that they're not unusual, just the way they use it is unusual. And furthermore, we don't care about the general cognitive abilities as it relates to brain structure. Because if we find out later in the piece, it doesn't play a role, that the cognitive abilities have no relationship to mental athletes. Furthermore, D is not, even though they touch on these things, cognitive ability, brain structure, mental athletes, that's not the question that she's hoping to answer. She's not asking at the onset, I wonder what the relationship is between cognitive ability and brain structure. She's not saying that. She cares about, if I go back to this quote, and I feel like it's kind of like cheating almost because we have the quote highlighted, but that's just where the answer is. Are the memorizer, they, McGuire and John and Elizabeth, they want to find out, are the memorizers' brains structurally different, or are they making better use of memory abilities? So I really think the answer for number 45 is going to be C. Does heightened memorization ability reflect abnormal brain structure? Is it physically different, or is it a different way of using the brain, which we find out it is? C for 45, but just to be sure, let's take a look at the quotes for 46. Question number 46 on the reading portion of College Board's Test 5. So 46 is the quote question, the 45. We know, and we think at least, that the answer in number 45 is going to be C. But just to be sure, let's answer 46 in isolation from these answer choices from 45. So let's get rid of the answer choice for 45, and we have to find a quote that answers a very particular question. That question is, which question was McGuire's study of mental athletes primarily intended to answer? So what did she primarily intend to do? Her study. What did McGuire's study initially, primarily intend to answer? What question? Let's read 27 and 29. Is this the question she was hoping to answer? After her groundbreaking study of London cabbies, McGuire decided to turn her attention to mental athletes. We're getting warmer. We're talking about what this whole thing was about, what question she wanted to answer. But that's not a question. That's not like an open idea. It's not her primary study intended to answer turning to mental athletes. It doesn't answer the question. Not like an A. What about B? 33, 37. Does this talk about what McGuire's study primarily intended to answer? What does this thing primarily intend to do? They wanted to find out if the memorizers' brains were, like the London cabbies, structurally different from the rest of ours, or if they were somehow just making better use of memory abilities that we all possess. This is the question she wanted to answer because she teamed up with Elizabeth Valentine, John Wilding, and what did they do? They wanted to find out. They wanted to answer. The scientists wanted to answer if the memorizers' brains were structurally different, or do they just make different use of the brain? So I really like B in that case, because it's just directly answering the question in 45. What was the primary, question they had to answer? Are their brains different or not? Very simple. What a C, 38 to 43. Is this talking about what her study primarily intended to answer? The researchers put both the mental athletes and a group of matched control subjects into MRI scanners and asked them to memorize 3-digit numbers, black and white photographs of people's faces, and magnified images of snowflakes while their brains were being scanned. That wasn't the question that they wanted to answer. They were not saying like, oh, we want to find out if we can match, control subjects, put them in MRI scanners, and ask them to memorize images. What was the question they wanted to answer? This is not a question that's being answered. This is, I think, just the method of the experiment. Again, don't get caught up in the fact that the experiment is concrete to the real drive of why they care about it, doing this experiment in the first place. So I don't like how C falls short of that. And what about D? Does this talk about what the authors primarily intended to answer? McGuire, what she wanted to come up with or identify? What's more, on every single test of general cognitive ability, the mental athlete scores came back well within the normal ranges. So did she want to find out, McGuire wanted to find out if we think D is the right answer, if the general cognitive ability, what's the deal with general cognitive ability with mental athletes? So I see how D matches up with D for number 45. However, realize just because they match up, that doesn't mean that was the initial primary goal that she wanted to study. She didn't want to study cognitive ability as it relates to, mental athletes. She cared about, if we go back to 33 to 37, Are the brains structurally different? That's the one thing that matters. 46, the answer is going to be B, and that nicely matches up with 45, which is going to be C.